There is a strange, emotional pattern that many people experience but few truly understand. It feels magnetic, intense, and deeply consuming, yet at the same time, it feels unstable, confusing, and emotionally distant. One moment, there is closeness that feels almost spiritual, and the next moment, there is silence that feels like rejection. This is the mystery of avoidant emotional patterns, where intensity exists without true attachment. It is a dynamic where connection feels powerful, but consistency feels impossible. People often mistake this intensity for love, but it operates on a completely different emotional system. To understand this mystery is not about labeling people as good or bad. It is about understanding emotional defense mechanisms, fear responses, and the subconscious way some individuals protect themselves from closeness while still craving connection. What follows are 6 key insights that reveal how intensity can exist without emotional attachment, and why this pattern feels so addictive, confusing, and difficult to break. What makes this pattern so powerful at the beginning is how easily the mind mistakes emotional scarcity for emotional depth. When someone is not consistently available, when their attention comes in fragments instead of flow, every small interaction begins to carry disproportionate emotional weight. A short message is no longer just a message, it feels like significance. A brief moment of warmth is no longer ordinary. It feels meaningful, rare, even special. This is where the illusion begins to form. The emotional mind does not naturally calculate connection based on consistency. It calculates based on impact, and impact is amplified when something is rare. So when emotional availability is limited, the brain begins to assign value to the gaps rather than the presence. What is not given becomes more powerful than what is actually received. In this state, distance is misread as depth. Silence is misread as mystery. Emotional unavailability is misread as complexity, and the absence of consistent connection creates a kind of psychological projection where the mind fills in what is missing with imagination, hope, and interpretation. The person is no longer experienced as they are, but as what they could be during their rare moments of emotional openness. This creates a subtle distortion. The relationship begins to feel intense, not because there is consistent emotional bonding, but because the nervous system is constantly reacting to emotional unpredictability. Every return after distance feels like relief. Every moment of attention after silence feels like reward. And the emotional contrast between absence and presence creates a heightened internal experience that can easily be mistaken for deep attachment. But in reality, what is being experienced is not depth, it is deprivation. Emotional deprivation amplifies sensitivity. When connection is inconsistent, the mind becomes hyper-aware of every detail, every shift, every slight change in tone or timing. This heightened awareness feels like emotional intimacy, but it is actually a state of emotional monitoring. The mind is not resting in connection, it is tracking it. Over time, this creates a loop where the emotional system begins to chase meaning in minimal input. A single moment of attention can outweigh days of silence. A small gesture can erase emotional discomfort temporarily. And because the experience is so internally intense, it feels like something significant is happening between two people, even when the actual relational foundation is unstable or incomplete. The deeper illusion is that intensity equals connection. But intensity in this context is not born from mutual emotional building. It is born from imbalance. One side is reaching, interpreting, hoping, and filling gaps, while the other side is inconsistent in presence. This imbalance creates emotional tension, and that tension is mistaken for chemistry. What makes this even more powerful is that the mind often prefers meaning over emptiness. So instead of recognizing inconsistency as lack of availability, it reframes it into something more emotionally digestible: mystery, depth, complexity, or emotional uniqueness. This reframing protects the emotional investment from collapsing too early, but it also keeps the illusion alive longer than it should. The result is a powerful internal experience that feels like connection but is actually constructed through absence. And because absence is emotionally loud in its own way, it becomes easy to confuse the emotional noise of uncertainty with the quiet stability of real attachment. Emotional withdrawal creates one of the most confusing psychological experiences because it does not register as simple rejection in the mind. Instead, it activates something far more complex: curiosity, pursuit, and emotional activation. When someone becomes inconsistent, distant, or hard to read, the brain does not always interpret it as "this connection is ending." More often, it interprets it as "this connection is unresolved." And unresolved emotional experiences are the ones the mind tries hardest to complete. This is where withdrawal begins to feel like attraction, not because distance is inherently desirable, but because unpredictability triggers attention. The human nervous system is wired to respond strongly to uncertainty. When emotional behavior is consistent, the mind relaxes. When it becomes inconsistent, the mind activates. And activation feels like importance. So when someone pulls away emotionally, instead of creating closure, it often creates heightened mental focus. Thoughts increase. Interpretation begins. Attention narrows. The emotional system shifts from receiving connection to trying to decode it. And in that decoding process, emotional energy becomes heavily invested. This is where confusion begins to form, because the feeling of thinking about someone constantly gets mistaken for emotional depth. But what is actually happening is not connection, it is cognitive activation. The brain is attempting to solve inconsistency like a puzzle. And puzzles create engagement, not necessarily attachment. The more unpredictable the emotional presence becomes, the more the mind tries to predict the next moment of connection. This prediction loop creates anticipation, and anticipation is emotionally stimulating. It produces a sense of excitement, urgency, and emotional focus that can feel very similar to attraction. But underneath this stimulation is instability, not bonding. Withdrawal also creates contrast. When emotional presence is occasional, each return feels amplified. A simple message after silence can feel disproportionately meaningful. A small gesture after distance can feel emotionally significant. This contrast effect deepens the emotional impact, making the rare moments of connection feel more intense than they actually are in context. And this is where the psychological trap forms. The nervous system begins to associate emotional spikes with connection itself. So instead of valuing consistency, it starts valuing emotional highs. Instead of seeking stability, it begins to chase moments of relief. And relief always follows absence, not presence. This is why emotional withdrawal can feel strangely magnetic. It is not because distance is inherently attractive, but because the nervous system begins to build a cycle of activation and release. When connection disappears, stress increases. When it returns, relief follows. Over time, the brain starts anticipating relief as reward, and the person becomes emotionally significant not because of steady presence, but because of repeated emotional interruption. The most misleading part of this experience is that it feels personal. The intensity of internal thoughts, the emotional highs and lows, and the constant mental focus all create the impression that something profound is happening between two people. But in reality, much of this experience is happening internally, not relationally. It is the nervous system reacting to uncertainty, not two people building consistent emotional intimacy. And because the mind naturally tries to find meaning in emotional activation, it often interprets withdrawal as a sign of deeper, hidden connection, as if the distance itself is part of a larger emotional narrative waiting to be completed. But what is actually unfolding is a loop of attention without stability. Over time, this loop can become emotionally consuming. The mind becomes conditioned to wait for moments of return, to interpret silence, to read into gaps, and to find meaning in inconsistency. And the stronger this conditioning becomes, the harder it is to distinguish between genuine emotional bonding and psychological activation. In truth, emotional withdrawal does not create attachment, it creates engagement. And engagement without consistency feels like intensity, but it does not build emotional security. The push-pull cycle creates one of the most powerful emotional traps because it is built on contradiction. It delivers connection and distance in alternating patterns, and the nervous system is not designed to remain neutral in contradiction. It reacts, it adjusts, it tries to predict, and in doing so, it becomes deeply involved even when stability is missing. At the beginning of this cycle, the push feels like closeness, warmth, emotional availability, or even intimacy that seems genuine and promising. In these moments, the mind relaxes and interprets the connection as real and developing. There is emotional relief because attention is present, and presence is interpreted as safety. But this state does not last long. Then comes the pull. Emotional distance appears. Communication slows, energy shifts, responses become inconsistent, or complete silence replaces engagement. And suddenly, the nervous system experiences a drop, not just in interaction, but in emotional certainty. This shift creates discomfort because the mind was just anchored in connection, and now that anchor is removed. This contrast is where the cycle becomes psychologically powerful. The emotional system does not simply register absence, it registers change. And rapid change between presence and absence creates heightened internal arousal. The mind becomes alert. It starts scanning for meaning. It begins to analyze timing, tone, behavior, and patterns. This analysis feels like emotional investment, but it is actually the brain trying to restore predictability. When the connection returns again, the push phase begins. And this return does not feel neutral, it feels amplified. Because after emotional absence, even small gestures feel significant. A simple message feels comforting. A short conversation feels meaningful. The emotional contrast between pull and push creates a relief response, and relief is powerful enough to feel like connection. This is where the cycle becomes addictive. Not because the relationship is stable or nourishing, but because the nervous system becomes conditioned to expect reward after withdrawal. The unpredictability itself becomes the hook. If emotional availability were constant, the system would settle. But because it is inconsistent, the mind stays engaged, always anticipating the next shift. Over time, this creates a pattern where emotional intensity is no longer tied to depth of connection, but to fluctuation. The more unstable the rhythm, the more emotionally charged the experience feels. And this is why people often describe these dynamics as passionate or deep, even when there is no consistent foundation supporting them. Another important layer is the internal negotiation that happens during the pull phase. When distance appears, the mind rarely accepts it as final. Instead, it searches for explanation. It tries to decode the change. It replays previous interactions. It searches for what was done wrong or what might restore closeness. This creates mental preoccupation, and preoccupation feels like emotional attachment. But what is actually happening is not bonding. It is uncertainty management. The push-pull cycle also reshapes emotional expectations. Over time, stability can start to feel unfamiliar or even less stimulating. This happens because the nervous system becomes conditioned to emotional spikes rather than steady connection. So calm consistency may feel underwhelming, while inconsistency feels exciting. But excitement in this context is not a sign of compatibility. It is a sign of emotional conditioning. The deeper issue is that this cycle prevents emotional grounding. Instead of building secure connection, it builds anticipation, reaction, and interpretation. The emotional system never fully rests because it is always preparing for the next shift. And anything that prevents emotional rest also prevents true attachment from forming. Eventually, the cycle becomes self-sustaining. The mind starts to chase the push phase while enduring the pull phase, believing that closeness is always just around the corner. But the pattern itself keeps resetting the emotional progress, making stability feel constantly out of reach. What appears as intensity is actually instability in motion, repeated, familiar, and emotionally charged enough to feel meaningful, but never consistent enough to become secure. Emotional safety is one of the most misunderstood foundations of human connection because it does not feel dramatic and it does not create emotional spikes. It feels steady, predictable, and often quiet. But for a nervous system that has become accustomed to inconsistency, emotional safety can feel unfamiliar, even underwhelming. This is where a critical confusion begins, where activation is mistaken for connection and safety is mistaken for lack of intensity. Emotional activation is different. It is the state where the nervous system is constantly alert, constantly interpreting, and constantly reacting. It is triggered by uncertainty, unpredictability, and inconsistency. When someone's emotional presence is not stable, the mind enters a heightened state of awareness. Every message, every delay, every shift in tone becomes significant. The emotional system becomes hyper-attuned, scanning for meaning in small changes. This heightened state creates intensity. Thoughts feel deeper. Emotions feel stronger. The body reacts more strongly to small interactions. And because everything feels amplified, the experience can easily be mistaken for deep emotional connection. But what is actually happening is not grounding, it is activation. The nervous system is not relaxed into connection, it is reacting to uncertainty. Emotional safety, on the other hand, does not create that same internal noise. It is built on consistency, clarity, and reliability. When someone is emotionally safe, their presence does not require decoding. Their availability is not unpredictable. Their responses are not emotionally confusing. This creates a calm internal environment where the nervous system does not need to constantly evaluate or interpret. But here is where the distortion happens. A nervous system that has adapted to emotional unpredictability often associates intensity with importance. If something does not create emotional spikes, it can feel like something is missing. The absence of emotional turbulence can be misinterpreted as lack of depth, lack of passion, or lack of connection. But in reality, it is often the presence of stability. This is why emotional safety can initially feel uncomfortable for someone used to activation. The mind may interpret calmness as boredom. Predictability may feel like emotional flatness. Consistency may feel like something is missing. But what is actually missing is not depth, it is chaos. And chaos is not a requirement for connection, even though it often feels like it when the nervous system is conditioned to it. Emotional activation, by contrast, creates a powerful internal narrative. Because the experience is intense, the mind assumes meaning must be equally intense. This is where overinterpretation begins. A short moment of attention can feel profound. A period of withdrawal can feel deeply personal. Emotional highs and lows begin to define the perceived significance of the connection, even if the actual relational foundation is unstable. This is also why emotional activation can create dependency. The nervous system starts to rely on fluctuations to feel engaged. It begins to associate emotional unpredictability with aliveness. Without it, things can feel dull or emotionally flat. But this is not because safety lacks value. It is because the system has not yet recalibrated from intensity-based bonding to stability-based bonding. The deeper truth is that emotional safety allows attachment to form, while emotional activation often prevents it from stabilizing. Activation keeps the nervous system in a loop of anticipation and reaction. Safety allows the nervous system to settle into presence. One creates emotional noise. The other creates emotional grounding. But because activation is louder, it often gets mistaken for significance. The emotional spikes become evidence in the mind that something important is happening. Yet importance is not measured by intensity alone. It is measured by consistency, reliability, and emotional availability over time. Over time, the difference becomes clear. Activation creates emotional exhaustion masked as passion. Safety creates emotional stability that may not feel dramatic at first, but gradually builds trust and grounding. One keeps the mind engaged through uncertainty. The other allows the mind to rest in certainty. And this is the core misunderstanding, confusing emotional intensity with emotional connection, when in reality, one is a reaction to instability and the other is the foundation of real attachment. At the core of emotional distance is not indifference, but protection. What appears on the surface as withdrawal, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability is often rooted in a deeper internal mechanism designed to maintain control over emotional exposure. For some nervous systems, closeness does not automatically translate into safety. Instead, it can trigger a sense of vulnerability that feels overwhelming, consuming, or even threatening. When emotional closeness begins to increase, it activates internal alarms that are not always conscious. The experience of being seen, emotionally depended on, or deeply involved can create internal pressure. This pressure is not necessarily about the other person, but about the internal fear of losing emotional autonomy. So instead of moving deeper into connection, the system instinctively creates distance to regulate that internal intensity. This is where emotional fear becomes important to understand. It is not always fear of the other person. It is often fear of what closeness does internally. Closeness requires emotional openness, consistency, and presence. But for a system that associates intimacy with emotional exposure, this can feel like losing control over one's inner world. So distance becomes a form of regulation, a way to return to emotional equilibrium. However, this protective mechanism creates a paradox. The same behavior that prevents emotional overwhelm also prevents emotional attachment from fully forming. Because attachment requires sustained engagement, shared emotional space, and vulnerability over time. When distance interrupts this process repeatedly, connection remains fragmented. It may feel intense in moments of closeness, but it cannot stabilize into secure bonding. This is why the pattern often appears inconsistent. There may be moments of genuine connection, emotional openness, or even deep expression. But these moments are followed by withdrawal, silence, or emotional detachment. It is not necessarily a reflection of changing feelings, but rather a fluctuation in emotional tolerance. When closeness feels manageable, engagement increases. When it feels overwhelming, withdrawal becomes necessary. From the outside, this can feel confusing. The inconsistency can be interpreted as mixed signals or emotional uncertainty. But internally, it is often a balancing act between desire and fear. Desire pulls toward connection, while fear pulls toward protection. Neither fully disappears, and so the behavior oscillates between the two states. What makes this even more complex is that emotional distance does not eliminate emotional capacity. Feelings may still exist, but they are managed differently. Instead of being expressed through consistent presence, they may be experienced in waves, intense moments of connection followed by periods of emotional self-regulation. This creates a pattern where emotional expression is not steady but episodic. The key misunderstanding in this dynamic is interpreting distance as absence of feeling. In reality, distance can sometimes be a response to feeling too much, not too little. The emotional system pulls back, not because there is nothing there, but because what is there feels difficult to sustain without losing internal stability. This is why attempts to close the distance often create resistance. The more pressure there is for consistency, clarity, or emotional availability, the more the protective system activates. Not because connection is unwanted, but because the internal experience of closeness feels increasingly intense. So the system prioritizes regulation over engagement. Over time, this creates a relational pattern where emotional presence becomes unpredictable, not because connection is impossible, but because emotional safety has not been fully established internally. Without that sense of safety, closeness and distance continue to alternate as a form of self-protection. Ultimately, the fear behind distance is not rejection of connection itself, but rejection of emotional overwhelm. And until closeness can be experienced without triggering that internal alarm, the pattern of stepping forward and pulling back continues to repeat itself, creating intensity without stability and presence without permanence. Closure is often imagined as something that another person provides, an explanation, an apology, a final conversation, or a clear emotional ending that makes everything make sense. But in dynamics shaped by emotional inconsistency and avoidance patterns, closure rarely arrives in that form. Not because there is no story to tell, but because the emotional structure itself does not naturally resolve through verbal completion. The mind wants logic where the system operates through avoidance, emotional pacing, and internal regulation. This is why the search for closure can become one of the most painful parts of the experience. It keeps attention tied to the unresolved. The mind continues to revisit conversations, interpret silence, analyze timing, and search for meaning in incomplete emotional exchanges. It assumes that if enough understanding is reached, emotional peace will follow. But understanding alone does not always settle the nervous system, especially when the emotional pattern itself is built on inconsistency. In these dynamics, closure is often withheld not intentionally but structurally. Emotional avoidance tends to prevent deep final processing. Instead of clear endings, there are fading interactions. Instead of definitive conclusions, there is gradual distance. Instead of direct emotional articulation, there is silence that replaces explanation. This absence of clarity leaves space for interpretation, and interpretation becomes the emotional loop that keeps the connection psychologically active even when it is no longer relationally present. The mind struggles with this ambiguity because it is designed to seek completion. Unfinished emotional experiences feel open-ended, and open-ended experiences generate internal tension, so the nervous system continues to engage with what is no longer externally active. It replays moments, searches for hidden meaning, and constructs narratives that attempt to fill the gap left by absence. This process feels like emotional processing, but it often becomes emotional prolonging. What makes this even more complex is that closure is often expected from the same source that created the inconsistency. There is an internal hope that clarity will eventually come from the same pattern that avoided clarity in the first place. This expectation keeps emotional attention locked in place. The mind waits for resolution from a system that was never structured to provide it in a direct way. Over time, the realization begins to emerge that closure cannot be forced through external explanation alone. Because the emotional confusion was not only created by what was said or not said, but by the entire pattern of inconsistency itself. And patterns do not resolve through single moments. They dissolve through understanding and detachment from the cycle that keeps them emotionally alive. This is where internal closure begins to take shape. It does not come from receiving final answers, but from recognizing the structure of the experience itself. Once the pattern is seen clearly, once it is understood that intensity was driven by inconsistency, that attachment was disrupted by withdrawal, and that emotional activation was mistaken for depth, the need for external resolution begins to weaken. The emotional charge starts to lose its grip, not because everything is explained, but because the system no longer feeds on unanswered questions. The mind stops searching for meaning in the behavior and starts recognizing the behavior as a pattern rather than a puzzle. And that shift is what gradually reduces emotional dependency on closure from outside. Eventually, what remains is not complete explanation, but clarity of understanding. And that clarity becomes the real closure, not a moment given by someone else, but a realization formed internally. The story may not end with perfect answers, but it ends with recognition of how the emotional experience functioned. And in that recognition, the loop finally begins to loosen. Not because everything was resolved externally, but because the mind stops expecting resolution from the place where inconsistency began.